Thanks everyone for sticking around to the last presentation. Thanks very much to the organizers for putting on this timely event. Like I said, I'm Dan Zimmer, and we just learned about ways to end consumerism. I'm going to talk about the origins of consumerism. So with that, let's begin. In 1961, US President John F. Kennedy stood before the United Nations General Assembly to declare, as he had been declaring, quote, "Today, every inhabitant of this planet must contemplate the day when this planet may no longer be habitable. Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident, miscalculation, or madness. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us," end quote. Today, as we contemplate the question of whether or not technology can save the planet, I believe that it is crucial to keep in mind that we are far from the first to be forced to contemplate the day when this planet may no longer be habitable. My talk will explore a few ways that the legacy of Kennedy's nuclear sword of Damocles may influence past and present questions about the role technology can play in sustaining or destroying planetary habitability. It consists of three parts. That was going to be so cool with multimedia. The sound system works. Anyway, I'm glad it got some use. So it consists of three parts. The first will address the composition of the nuclear sword of Damocles, foregrounding its underappreciated economic components. The second will consider some of the psychopolitical consequences of being exposed to this apparatus. And the third will try to apply some of these lessons to contemporary plans to combat global warming through solar geoengineering. By way of a disclaimer up front, I should note that I will be drawing most of my examples from the United States, but I believe that many of my main points may be more broadly applicable to a European context as well. So for part one, let's begin at the beginning. 2,400 years ago in the ancient city of Syracuse, it was here that the paranoid tyrant Dionysius took issue with one of his court flatterers, a man by the name of Damocles, when he praised the tyrant for his power and wealth and claimed that Dionysius must truly be the happiest man alive. The tyrant then asked Damocles if he would like to experience a taste of this happiness. The Roman statesman Cicero recounts what happened next, writing, quote, "When Damocles said that he should like it extremely, Dionysius ordered him to be laid on a bed of gold with the most beautiful covering, embroidered and wrought with the most exquisite work, and he dressed out a great many sideboards with silver and embossed gold. There were ointments and garlands, perfumes were burned, tables provided with most exquisite meats. Damocles thought himself very happy. In the midst of this apparatus, Dionysius ordered a bright sword to be let down from the ceiling, suspended by a single horsehair, so as to hang over the head of that happy man. After this, Damocles neither cast his eye on the well-wrought plate nor touched any of the provisions. Presently the garland fell to pieces. At last he entreated the tyrant to give him leave to go, saying that he now had no longer any desire to be happy," end quote. As you can see from this story, the sword of Damocles comprised not just two components, but three: the blade, the thread, and, just as importantly, the bed of gold beneath. Each of these bear direct analogy to the nuclear situation established by the United States in the 1950s. Firstly, and most obviously, there's the bright sword itself. This was forged from uranium, plutonium, and deuterium into an American arsenal that by the mid-1960s contained over 30,000 nuclear weapons. Then there's the horsehair thread that suspended the blade. Here too, the analogy is obvious, and in this case takes the form of the launch-on-warning nuclear command and control systems that hang by a hair trigger. Lastly, there is the part of the sword of Damocles that Kennedy did not mention, namely the bed of gold piled with exquisite luxuries. This ad actually appears 2 pages later in the same Life magazine that first showed a color image of the hydrogen bomb. So this is precisely the sort of consumer paradise that we're building. As you recall from Cicero's story, the bed of gold played an integral role in the lesson that the original sword of Damocles was meant to impart. Indeed, Cicero only recounted the story of Damocles to underscore his own rhetorical point that, quote, "There can be no happiness for one for whom terror is always impending," end quote. This is important because the luxuries piled on the bed of gold proved to be an integral part of the American nuclear sword of Damocles as well. Having cost roughly $7 trillion to date, it is easy to see America's nuclear arsenal as a great source of expense. It might surprise some of you, therefore, to learn that the United States initially manufactured the means to potentially destroy the human habitability of the planet as a cost-cutting measure. It was not inevitable that, having invented the atom bomb, the United States would proceed to develop the hydrogen bomb, nor inevitable that, having developed the hydrogen bomb, the United States would begin to mass produce it by the tens of thousands. Instead, as historians have noted, when facing a Cold War of potentially indefinite duration, the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s feared that excessive military spending during peacetime could prove just as lethal to American freedoms and economic dynamism as military defeat in wartime. Thermonuclear weapons offered what seemed like a deus ex machina at a time when, in the words of the so-called father of the hydrogen bomb, Edward Teller, the European nations and the United States were unwilling to commit the exceptionally great funds that would have been required to counterbalance the Soviet tank force with tanks, end quote. Not only did each of these new hydrogen bombs detonate with as much as 1,000 times the yield of the device that leveled Hiroshima, but they derived most of that force not from precious uranium or plutonium, but the fusion of readily available hydrogen. As an administration official explained at the time, quote, "One can immediately see the great gain in economy over the primitive Hiroshima bomb. We can get over our 20 megatons at the bargain basement price of $250,000. The same size of explosion with TNT could cost tens of billions of dollars, exclamation point," end quote. In case anyone may be wondering, this is indeed where the American phrase "getting more bang from the buck" comes from. According to the US Secretary of State, relying on the deterrent threat of mass thermonuclear retaliation offered what he termed the modern way of getting maximum protection at a bearable cost. But of course, cost cutting was not an end in and of itself. When justifying this new policy of massive nuclear retaliation to the American people, Eisenhower explained, quote, "Our approach to a position of military preparedness now makes it possible for the United States to turn more of its attention to a sustained improvement of national living standards. The sustained economic growth is necessary to the welfare and indeed the survival of America and the free world," end quote. True to his word, Eisenhower used the resulting defense savings to embark on a socially transformative domestic project, including the Federal Highway Act of 1956 and the Federal Housing Act of 1954. As has been well documented, these and similar policies helped to radically reshape the United States into a highly suburbanized consumer society, enjoying luxuriant living standards never before achieved on a mass scale. By 1970, American rates of car ownership, fossil fuel use, and solid waste production had more than doubled. American GDP per capita, already the highest in the world, rose by an additional 60%. This period of rapidly expanding economic growth and concomitant resource use has aptly been termed the Great Acceleration. Sprawling suburbs unfolded in a dreamscape of limitless consumption served up on a bed of gold. By the end of the 1950s, the components of the nuclear sword of Damocles were in place. By suspending the blade of massive thermonuclear retaliation over the golden bed of suburban mass consumption, the leadership of the United States had succeeded in jeopardizing all life on Earth for the sake of a high national living standard. With that, let us now turn to part 2 and consider what some of the psychological consequences of living beneath the nuclear sword of Damocles may have been. Recall, the historical sword of Damocles was designed as a weapon of psychological torture. What was it like for that first generation to experience the unprecedented material luxury of 1950s suburban consumer culture at the cost of total exposure to world-ending violence? Writing in 1965, the great American critic Susan Sontag vividly observed how, quote, "One gets the feeling that a mass trauma exists over the use of nuclear weapons and the possibility of future nuclear wars. From now on to the end of human history, every person will spend his entire life under the threat not only of individual death, which is certain, but of something almost unsupportable psychologically, collective incineration and extinction, which could come at any time, virtually without warning. Ours is indeed an age of extremity, for we live under continued threat of two equally fearful but seemingly opposed destinies, unremitting banality and inconceivable terror," end quote. Given the scale of the mass trauma of nuclear terror, there turned out to be remarkably little psychological research conducted on the subject. The American military commissioned several large studies in secret for civil defense purposes. However, most of the civilian researchers who approached nuclear issues soon abandoned the topic because of the psychic strain that it caused them personally. Those few who persisted, however, converged on a couple key themes. Firstly, and perhaps most unsurprisingly, researchers reported a pervasive sense of futurelessness among those they studied. This futurelessness seemed to manifest most acutely in children and adolescents who resented being asked what they wanted to be when they grew up on the assumption that they would no longer grow up at all. Relatedly, researchers found futurelessness accompanied by what a 1983 study called, quote, "a need to live in the present with the nuclear threat contributing to teenagers' tendencies towards impulsivity and immediacy in personal relationships and behavior," end quote. The child psychologist Sybil Escalona found that those she researched tended increasingly towards, in her words, focusing on the here and now and declining to invest energy and self-control in the attainment of distant goals, end quote. And yet, whether or not they expected the future to ever arrive, few of these young people fully gave up on life. As the psychologist Robert J. Lifton noted at the time, quote, "We recognize in children, as in ourselves, a double life, children preparing for adult life, studying and imagining marrying and having children of their own, but in another part of their minds, doubting that this will ever come to pass," end quote. In sum, the situation cultivated not only futurelessness, but with it a tendency to eschew long-term planning in favor of immediate gratification in a strange dual-track existence that was split between banality and terror and lived in constant expectation of being cut short. Lifton coined the term psychic numbing to describe the resulting syndrome. This numbing amounted to a sort of acquired ignorance that permitted people to function on a daily basis by putting the prospect of annihilation firmly out of mind. Using the terms developed earlier, we could say that this numbing arose as the result of building up the mass of psychic scar tissue required to keep the glint of the blade overhead out of view and attempt to enjoy the bed of gold underneath. The chief problem with psychic numbing, according to Lifton, is that it is ultimately a degenerative disease. In this case, the scar tissue that forms to insulate a particularly sharp psychic wound tends to spread, deadening as it goes. This sense of creeping numbing began to gather growing attention in the early 1980s. In his 1982 study, The Fate of the Earth, anti-nuclear political theorist Jonathan Schell observed with particular clarity how, when confronted by nuclear precarity, quote, "We are encouraged not to tackle our predicament, but to inure ourselves to it, to develop a special enfeebled vision, which is capable of overlooking the hugely obvious, a special sluggish nervous system, which is conditioned not to react even to the most extreme and urgent peril, and a special constricted mode of political thinking, which is permitted to creep around the edges of the mortal crisis in the life of our species, but never meet it head on. Before long, denial of reality becomes a habit, a dominant mode of life in our society, and unresponsiveness becomes a way of life. The society that has accepted the threat of its utter destruction soon finds it hard to react to lesser ills," end quote. 1982 also saw the aforementioned Escalona sum up her 2 decades of research into the nuclear futurelessness among children, writing, quote, "Growing up in a social environment that tolerates and ignores the risk of total destruction by means of voluntary human action tends to foster those patterns of personality functioning that can lead to a sense of powerlessness and cynical resignation. By the same token, the development of those characteristics that can generate and support future-oriented collective social action is made more difficult in the present social climate. In short, I believe that growing up fully aware that there may be no future and that the adult world seems unable to combat the threat can render the next generation less well equipped to avert actual catastrophe than they would be if the same threat existed in a different social climate," end quote. If there's any validity to these observations, they suggest that those who came of age beneath the nuclear sword of Damocles and began to enter into positions of power in the 1980s may have been almost uniquely poorly equipped to respond proactively to the discovery of another existentially dire but temporally distant catastrophe on the horizon. Unfortunately, that is exactly what happened. For part 3 of the talk, I would like to conclude by taking a brief look at how those raised beneath the nuclear sword of Damocles greeted the advent of global warming. Although the role that carbon dioxide plays in regulating Earth's temperature has been known since the 1890s, contemporary climate science only came of age with the rise of global weather monitoring and computer modeling in the 1970s. It was not until the 1980s that climate scientists felt sufficiently confident in their models to begin to voice the public alarm about looming global warming. This mounting chorus of concern came to a crescendo in 1988. It was during that year's unusually hot summer. If you heard about the Brundtland report earlier, that was one of the authors. It was during that year's unusually hot summer that the climate scientist James Hansen delivered his famous testimony to the US Congress, while over in Canada, a gathering of global leaders convened in Toronto for the landmark World Conference on the Changing Atmosphere. The then Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, opened this conference by famously declaring, quote, "As we near the end of the 20th century, humanity faces a crucial question. Will we devote our abilities, our energy, and our efforts to furthering short-term material well-being, or will we commit ourselves to enhancing life on planet Earth? For too long, we have neglected the fact that we have been playing lethal games with Earth's vital life support systems. Humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, and globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences could be second only to a global nuclear war," end quote. These were dire warnings. However, in hindsight, they also look like a case of world historically bad timing. The Berlin Wall fell just a year later in 1989. As the Soviet Union disintegrated and the Cold War came to a close, with it, there was a pervasive sense of the nuclear threat retreating. By 1991, The elated editors of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists pushed the hands of their iconic doomsday clock all the way back to an unprecedented 17 minutes to midnight. For the first time, American consumers who had been living nuclear double lives for decades found themselves free to enjoy their beds of gold in peace. What would happen if you were to tell such people, just as the terror began to abate, that they must now begin to concern themselves with a new threat whose ultimate consequences could be second only to a global nuclear war, as Brundtland put it, but would fall mostly on the grandchildren that they had never expected to have? Worse, imagine telling these people that the cause of this new threat was precisely the luxuriant, materially profligate, energy-intensive consumer lifestyles that they had hoped would finally make them happy now that the nuclear terror had receded. As early as 1995, the aforementioned Lifton began to observe what he termed, quote, a merging of nuclear fear with other apocalyptic threats, such as environmental destruction and global warming, end quote. Should any of these consumers have opted to ignore the new apocalyptic threat of global warming, they would have already had decades of experience putting such inconvenient truths about the precarity of their situation out of mind. To be clear, I do not bring all this up to in any way exculpate those who could have done so much to mitigate global warming during the key decades of the 1990s and 2000s for their failures to do so. However, I think it's equally important for both historical and strategic reasons to recognize that the generation who first confronted global warming were not fresh-faced apocalyptic newcomers, but the psychically scarred survivors of decades of nuclear terror. If they greeted global warming with all the numbness, indifference, constricted thinking, affective unresponsiveness, and cynical resignation that Lifton, Shell, and Escalona might have feared, then we have a right to be disappointed, but not surprised. Let me begin to wrap things up by addressing what some of this may mean for the present. This talk has tried to make the case that the consequences of long-term exposure to the nuclear swords of Damocles can help explain some of the shockingly numb and lethargic responses to the discovery of global warming. Since those initial failures of feeling, it has long been taken for granted that when a sufficiently large number of people begin to finally wake up from their stupor and take the crisis seriously, they will finally adopt the drastic changes needed to mitigate global warming. However, as you all know, those alive today have delayed far too long for mitigation efforts alone to keep the planet from warming by at least 2 degrees. Already, the early effects of warming have begun to have devastating impacts on those most vulnerable communities that are least responsible for causing the crisis. However, as the fires, floods, and heat waves of recent years reach increasingly into the lives of the wealthy, the denial and apathy of recent decades has begun to quickly give way to demands for immediate action. What forms might these actions take? Beginning in the mid-2000s, the ongoing failure of mitigation efforts began to lead to a resurgence of interest in technical geoengineering solutions that could help to slow, stall, or even reverse global warming. Some of these techniques, such as the unproven potential for carbon capture and storage at gigaton scales, are already built into the latest IPCC models as the only remaining way to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Other techniques, such as solar geoengineering, propose to reduce global temperatures by continually laying down a fine layer of reflective particles in the stratosphere. Advocates of solar geoengineering claim that their plans could cool the planet for fractions of a percentage point of the expected hundreds of trillions of dollars that will be required to implement mitigation, adaptation, and decarbonization strategies. Better yet, they also stand to offer the added benefit of decoupling global temperature from the composition of the atmosphere. This would in turn make it possible, in theory, to burn every last ounce of fossil fuel with relative impunity. One of the last survivors of the Eisenhower era, the aforementioned father of the hydrogen bomb, Edward Teller, took acute interest in solar geoengineering for precisely these reasons, proposing in a 1998 op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, quote, "If the politics of global warming requires that something must be done, let us play to our uniquely American strengths in innovation and technology to offset any global warming by the least costly means possible," end quote. But not everyone has been so enthusiastic. Opponents of solar geoengineering strategies, such as the eminent physicist Raymond Pierre Hubert, point out that these schemes, while cost-effective, would be profoundly dangerous, masking the symptoms of warming rather than addressing the underlying causes. Stratospheric solar geoengineering schemes risk precipitating a sudden, sharp spike in temperature, the much-discussed termination shock, if they are ever abruptly curtailed. Pierre Humbert warns us that, quote, "The perilous state such schemes would put our Earth into is analogous to the fate of poor Damocles, cowering under the sword precariously suspended by a single thread," end quote. For my own part, I believe it would be deeply unwise to render the ongoing habitability of the planet subject to the workings of a complex technical system that could break down at any moment through accident, miscalculation, or madness. It would be even more mad to create such a system not out of existential necessity, but as the most cost-effective way to perpetuate ecologically unsustainable forms of mass consumer society. And yet, if you belong to a nation that has already purchased its incredible prosperity at the cost of total precarity, how much easier might it be to strike this bargain a second time if you've already long since learned to live like there's no tomorrow? And so, by way of conclusion, a word of warning. Do not discount the appeal that solar geoengineering strategies may have for members of mass consumer societies. If the leadership of the United States, in particular, were to try to secure their country's continued economic growth by dimming the sun, this would only be the second time in living memory that they have knowingly placed all life on Earth in jeopardy for reasons of economic expediency. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I also heard you say this in Pardubice last week, and so I've had time to think about it a little bit. And I think the framing is, I mean, I really think it's a very important reminder about that. You know, these are not in many ways not new, but I guess the more I thought about it, the more I want to know exactly which generation you mean, because, you know, of course I wasn't there, but the Cold War goes through significant ups and downs and coolings and thaws, and I get the sense that, you know, fears of the kind of real sense that nuclear annihilation might happen is strongest kind of in the 50s and the 80s is broadly my sense. But for example, you also have the generations which, you know, the civil rights generations, the 1968 generations, which seem, you know, plausibly to be invested in some kind of future, right? They're not particularly futureless. So I'm kind of wondering, if you're kind of, if there's a lot being kind of telescoped here, or if you really do effectively mean people who grew up in the 1950s and who were then, you know, whatever, the age to be in power in the 80s and 90s. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Great question. You're right about two things. One, there's a ton of work that's being telescoped here, so a lot of nuance has been left on the cutting room floor, but also that there is this interestingly cyclical intergenerational element, that it was the 1950s and early 1960s when there was a lot of public discussion of kind of the terror that the bomb was inflicting, the bomb, as the boomer generation called it. And then this weird resurgence of about 5 years in the 1980s, when people once again took to the streets, there were mass protests and a lot of kind of public anxiety about nuclear weapons. And then I think we can see that kind of analogously returning with Extinction Rebellion and similar things in the last few years. And, you know, I don't claim that this explains everything by any means, but I think that there's a way in which every generation seems to rediscover that, wow, for no really good reason, I and everyone that I know and love and most life on Earth could be killed at any moment. And that's just an insane thing to add to the human condition, just like total universal precarity and exposure to world-ending violence. And then they rebel against their extinction, and then to date, they've all failed. And then they seem to acquire what I tried to diagnose, some of these coping mechanisms for just learning not to think about it and trying to ignore it. And so one of my points is that once you transition to global warming, you can't ignore it in the way that you used to be able to, because everyone has ignored nuclear weapons. They will remain in their silos. But fires, floods, et cetera, are beginning to actually impinge on people's lives. So I think that those have been the dynamics up until this point, but they might be quite different going forward.
Thanks. This was very lovely. So one can, I feel like one can ask almost the opposite question to the narrative that you were posing. That is the sort of end of the nuclear threat and the beginning of sort of inability to grasp the new era. And that is one thing that people from 50s onwards got used to, is that large portion of the state budget goes to a completely senseless adventurist policy that never really comes to any fruition. And if by the beginning of the end of the Cold War, the government just 1/2 of that sum directs to a sort of more purposeful activity toward the future, would citizens really be that much objecting to the redirecting of the funds which were lost anyway?
So if they were to redirect money from defense spending... Well, in an American...
Some reasonably good justification of this.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be very in favor of that. Other people would just rather have that money given back to them in tax cuts so they can drive their even larger trucks with even cheaper gas. But at the same time, you say that it never came to fruition. I think one of the things that I try and stress is that causing terror was the purpose of these weapons, and that the non-event of nuclear war is to some extent a sign of the success and that they worked as they were supposed to, because everyone was so terrified that they didn't move for fear of bringing the nuclear sword of Damocles down on their heads. So this also has important ramifications for how we address global warming because of this highly conservative function of the nuclear sword of Damocles, which basically gives you a veto power to destroy the world if people are going to change it to such a degree that you would rather die than live in the world that they're trying to create. So these things do have surprising power even if they aren't ever launched, which is why $7 trillion might not seem like a bad investment for some people. Those are great questions. And Ukraine provides a nice counterexample to some things I've been claiming, precisely because the average age in the American Senate is 65. Joe Biden is 80. These people it's a gerontocracy. They're gerontocrats. They're old rulers. And they're so old that they actually do have this terror of nuclear weapons because they were raised in that kind of first paroxysm of panic in the 1950s. So precisely because there's been a lot of the worst nuclear threats that have been issued by a country other than the United States since the 1960s, with Putin claiming that he would respond to threats by going nuclear, did cause, I think, a lot of potentially salutary caution on the part of the Biden administration and caused them to rein in military advisors who are from several generations younger who think, we're spending all this money, we now have the sufficiently sophisticated command and control systems to wage tactical nuclear war, we should do it. We should stop those columns going into Kyiv with a small tactical nuke, for instance. So nuclear fear can also have a valuable self-restraining elements. And that is one area in which I'm glad that the American president is super old, because they actually were aware of how dire this is compared to some of the younger, particularly congressional Republicans. And then AI as an existential risk. I likewise am not staying up at night because of fears of artificial superintelligence taking over the planet, converting into paper clips, or paving it under solar panels. But the way in which artificial intelligence is being incorporated into nuclear command and control systems is quite alarming. I've met people in the American Air Force who really view the next war, because what we've had is a compression of time in warfighting over the course of the 20th century. The Schlieffen Plan invading Belgium because Germany didn't think it would have time to mobilize on two fronts. Second World War, they thought that planes would, bomb their enemies into submission within hours. Thermonuclear war, a half hour. But now there's a sense that with new ICBMs and having artificial intelligence in the loop, the time has been compressed to such an infinitesimal window that you basically need to offload all of the major decision-making to AI systems. And given the dozens of documented, already known moments when the nuclear sword of Damocles nearly snapped, and if anyone works with AI systems, you know how buggy they are and roll out, and how, especially if you're doing machine learning, you don't actually know what the capability overhang is and what's going on under the hood. That is a way in which it could be an existential threat if it forces some sort of command and control arms race to incorporate more and better AI so that you don't have someone move first against you.